Hey all, it's KR King of D&D Homebrew, talking today about the 4 secrets to successfully running city and town adventures. And this came out of, I did a PDF for my Night Patreon supporters of a shanty town, a keyed map, and kind of gave some ideas of how you might run that. And then for my Duke supporters, I did a video, the old high-end GM of thinking about what cities and towns mean in your world and how that dictates how the players interact with those. And then for this video, I just thought, I'm going to kind of boil this down in terms of adventures and storylines that you might do in a city and try to remove some of the, limitations people put on themselves when doing this, as opposed, again, when you're homebrewing a sandbox world and you're creating settlements and whatnot. But oftentimes I've heard this from GMs, I just sort of role play that or whatnot. I don't really have encounters and stuff there. Those tend to be dungeon crawls or wilderness or whatever. And I think you're missing out if that's the case. So the 4 principles are to think about how cities are like dungeons and how they're not. How cities and towns are like the wilderness and how it's not, in terms of the storylines and encounters. Then the third is to keep things simple. You don't have to sweat the details of every structure in your city or town. You just need to have a general sense of that, as we'll see, and then some locations. And then the final thing is to think up encounters and storylines and whatever that are very specific to a city or town environment. So first of all, how are cities and towns like dungeons? Well, they have walls, right, that restrict movement. The walls around the city, if it's a fortified city. And then the walls of all the structures that have a door that, you can lock the door. And then between those structures are streets, avenues or public areas. And then you have alleys and things like that. Again, depending on the area of the city, you might have a poor area. Again, when I did my shanty town, I had very narrow, winding streets, much like, say, the 5-foot walls of snaking through some dungeon where you're expecting to be perhaps surprised at things hiding there. Maybe the players have to go in single file when they're walking around. And that's very dungeon-like. Also, at night, depending on the lighting, it could be pitch black in a city environment, like a dungeon. But of course, this gets to how it's not like a dungeon. During the daytime, it's light. Why? Because you're outside. And there are no ceilings. So, if a player in the group has a familiar or something that can be flying around, the players could be flying, people can look down on you from upper story windows or on rooftops or whatnot. If you have a keep with a huge tower and they can see the entire area and see outside, you don't have that in a dungeon environment. And this gets then to the, how is it like a wilderness? Well, there you have it. In the wilderness, of course, you're outside like you are in a city, except when you're not, when you're in a structure, when you're in the basement, when you're in the dungeon that might be under a city, right? You have this day-night effect. But the biggest difference, I think, between, and I'm going to include these both together, of dungeon and wilderness, is people live in this place. Right? Unless you're running some Underdark campaign or everyone's goblins or kobolds or something, most humanoids live in a city-town environment, not under the ground and not just out in a, nomadic herding kind of thing. Again, you have these characters with the outlander or hermit thing or whatever your system is, but typically you're going to be gathered together and you live in a city. So this habitation creates an environment that is unique, that is inherently different than a dungeon or wilderness environment as defined by a lot of RPG settings. And you want to keep that in mind, as we'll see, when you're creating storyline. So the third principle is keeping things simple. When you make a map, you're homebrewing a city. I have a video on this, and I'm going to use this map to kind of dive deep into this, as we'll see. And I did the city of Maneth. I showed how I used another software package. Again, you can check out the video. I'll put a link here to it. But I created that kind of block map of a city. And I talk about there, you just want to identify certain areas. Here's the wharf on the sea. Here's the keep. Here are the walls. Here are the gates. Here are where, poor people live or middle class or however you want to define that. And then you leave it alone. And then you define the areas where the players are going to have an encounter. And if we look at this map that I made for my campaign, Maneth is this kind of wide open city. It doesn't, as you'll notice, have a keep or a central control point. It's actually controlled by different factions. And I've given them, the players would get this map and they would see these names on here. So the Ezrans, the Skanos, Wesgars, and everything that control this. And there's a few landmarks. Here's a central water area that the townspeople come to get water. That's a square. You also have one here. But notice that, the detail, this is what the players would have. These are structures over here outside the city, and you have them over here, the shanty town, the poor people. These are where farmers are. This ruins became something very significant later in the campaign. Then if I want to go detailed, the players bought a tavern. So I created this tavern. You'll notice down here to the south, it's built along the wall that runs to the outside of the city. So here's the first floor of the tavern. I have the street out here. I didn't do these other structures. This is the detail we needed because we had some encounters there. Here's the upstairs floor where all it's also an inn, the highfalutin rooms up top. The players eventually bought this and took over these rooms as their own and then continued to rent these out. If we go back to the first floor and we look down here, there is this trapdoor, and this leads to a basement, a storage area. And here's the storage area. And then if we go up, it leads to these catacombs. And then there's another thing down here, and I had a whole catacomb thing that was a burial chamber or whatnot. But in each instance here, these were the structures that were relevant to the players, not so much all of the structures out here. I also had an encounter in this town square at one point. I turned this into a well, which I created like this. This is one where all these roofs are on the structures. You're just outside. You can't see in there. Here's various carts. This is a place where merchants would gather and sell their goods. And here is the well. I made a map without any roofs on this if you wanted to go inside. It's not that much detail because, in fact, the players never did go in there. They just had this encounter outside here. I just know how big these structures are, and I could run that. But basically, it was an exterior encounter. And those maps are fun, the tavern map or the town square map or however you want to do this, a sewer system. Those are really fun. And, of course, as I talked about in another video, I'll put a link up here about running Theater of the Mind. I like to have a map, a fairly detailed map, even if I'm going to run a Theater of the Mind. So just where I know what's going on, where things are. Like that town square, I just know, okay, there's carts and everything. And the players say, well, how far is it across the square and all that kind of stuff. I like to have that, but you could certainly run it that way. And I just enjoy making maps, so it's kind of a fun thing for me. And then the final category is thinking of storylines and encounters that are specific to a city, specific to a place where people live, right? It isn't just, I'm going to go out into the city and start looking for monsters to kill or, treasure hoards or abandoned temples or this or that. Those are the things for the wilderness or the dungeon. This is where people live, but there's tons of potential here for storylines. I mean, a classic is you've got to steal something, right? And where is it being hidden? A rich merchant's house, like a fortress. And you've heard that and again, depending on the alignment of the players, however you play, that's in your system. Whatever this merchant did, maybe they're commissioned to do this, he shouldn't have it. Whatever the circumstances are, now you have to case the place out, maybe do some exploration, find out what the guards are, what kind of security they have. Then the players maybe sneak in. They want to sneak in, get this, and sneak back out and not cause problems. Why? Because people live in a city. If you have some huge battle, you're going to attract a lot of attention. And of course, the merchant's going to know that he's been ripped off, depending on if that's how you want to do this. Someone's been kidnapped, or they're not sure if they're kidnapped. They think they're being held. The same sort of thing where there's a lot of stealth involved. There's a lot of sneaking around, figuring this out, going in, finding the person and getting them out, or busting them out. Busting someone out of a jail. And this may be where you go into a city where someone's being held, bust them out and get the heck out of there. And maybe you are followed or it makes a big noise. Again, depending on how you want to do this, because it's not like it's a bunch of, an orc village. You go in and you defeat the orcs and rescue the prisoners. And off you go, and you don't care what happened to that orc village or whatever it is, these sentient humanoids in the wilderness. Well, in a city, first of all, there's going to be a lot more people, and there's a civil structure here that can get to you. So you're modifying that. The behavior, the players have to be more sophisticated. They have to think this through, right? If you have a cult and it's hiding in plain sight, or it's secret, it's just they've set up on the wharf a benevolent society to help the downtrodden. But in fact, every once in a while, one of those downtrodden disappears, and they're taken to the cult's headquarters. So you can run the wharf kind of theater, the mine kind of thing, until they get to the warehouse where underneath is the secret, sacrifice chamber where the high priests are conducting their rites. That becomes an encounter environment, depending on what you're doing, VTT, battle maps, or again, theater of the mind. But that's where we're going to get into the classic sort of battle situation in this city environment. And of course, who's involved in the cult? Is it someone who is prominent in the city, someone, the vizier to the king, or something like that? You get into all that kind of intrigue when the players are trying to figure out what's going on. Lots of social encounters, lots of role play, lots of exploration, that kind of thing. But still, you get down to that nitty gritty of this. And again, those are the details that you create without worrying about all the elaborate buildings or whatever it is in this city. Because the inherent difference between a dungeon and a wilderness environment and a city environment is that people live there, function, have a social structure, have some kind of government, have some, thing that collectively for security and for commerce and trade, right? That, why did the guy Willie Sutton robs banks? Because that's where the money is. And there's more money, more treasure potentially in a city environment, certainly city, but even in a town, than necessarily going off. Maybe you make the big score and discover the lost treasure, but a lot of times it's just a little bit here and a little bit there. Well, in a city, that's where you can do that, but people are going to come after you. So I think it's a very fruitful environment. Just remember those differences and similarities. Remember not to sweat the details, and then create great storylines based on the city environment, and you will have fun. And a shout out, as always, to my Patreon supporters. Thank you so much. Thanks for inspiring this series of the map and videos, and just the kind of, stimulating that thought process that I think helps to generate ideas about all my viewers out there being GMs in a homebrewed sandbox type environment. And if you like what you've seen on my channel, please subscribe. Always looking for more. And I'd love to hear what do you guys think about? How often do you run city environments? And how do you do that? And what kind of storylines do you come up with? And finally, as always, for all of you to keep playing an RPG game, whichever one you choose. And remember to tell somebody else about it.